I grew up in the 60s, and I think many of you here may have grown up through those years, some of you as parents. And as parents, you may have wondered what was going on in your country and in your world. But as young people, we were expressing, each of us in our own particular way, a great hope. And that hope was expressed by poets in many, many ways. And some of you will recall some of those songs that were sung by young people with such great anticipation of a world made new. And this is one of those songs that means something to me. And if you do know the words, you can join in, but then I might get lost. But let's just see how it goes. Last night I had the strangest dream I've ever dreamed before. I dreamed that good folk everywhere had put an end to war. I dreamed I saw a mighty room filled with women and men, and the papers they were signing said they'd never fight again. And when the papers all were signed, a million copies made, they all joined hands and bowed their heads as grateful prayers were prayed. And the people in the streets below were dancing all around, while swords and guns and uniforms lay scattered on the ground. And the first verse. Last night I had the strangest dream I ever dreamed before. I dreamed that good folk everywhere had put an end to war. The Bible speaks about a sower going forward and sowing seeds. Up until the 60s, in the Western world, there were ideas which were dominant ideas. That is to say, they were ideas that everybody lived by, everybody accepted, and everybody honored. But in the 60s, a generation rose up and looked at the consequences following from those ideas and started to ask questions. And those persons were mainly the young, who were realizing that the values of their society were perhaps not healthy for them as people or for the planet on which they lived. Now, in many ways, that movement of young hearts and minds was misrepresented in the media, so that they were called hippies and they were portrayed as drug-addicted, crazy people who just wanted to have sex all of the time. That was one of the stories that the establishment told to discredit the hope of the serious young people who were prepared to sacrifice much in the hope of peace. That is to say, the young people of the 60s had something in common with all of those persons who gave their lives to put on uniforms and make industrialists rich. You see, in the 60s, we determined that the truth was more important than just being able to sleep comfortably at night. And so some of the questions that were being raised troubled society. We all who lived through that will remember the image of an American university campus in which students were slain by National Guard personnel under orders to silence this uprising of resistance to things that were considered to be normal. Now I say those things, but I want to bring them down to where we sort of live. And the way I did that in my own thoughts this week was to recall that November the 11th is my youngest sister's birthday. She's 20 years younger than I am, and I have become so proud as an older brother to see her in her marriage with a husband and the 3 children which they have brought into this world and raised. And in looking at my sister and her husband and her 3 children, I thought of this family as the reason for any effort we might make in the interest of establishing justice and through justice finding peace. But as I went on to think about my sister and her husband, I realized that after the First World War and preparing for the Second World War, in all of the involved countries, there were young families. There were young families in Canada, just like my sister and her husband. There were young families in America. There were young families in Britain. And we can sympathize so far. But there were young families in Germany. There were young families in Russia. There were young families in Japan. There were young families all over the earth. And the only thing they were really wanting was to grow up in peace, to grow up healthy, to grow up happy. But the world during that period was in great trouble. And that trouble was economic. It seemed that the promise of the Industrial Revolution had presented issues that were not foreseen. And the economies of all the developed countries stood still and collapsed. And something had to be done. And that's when the war came, the Second World War. And that's when sons and daughters in Germany, sons and daughters in England, sons and daughters in Canada, sons and daughters in Japan, sons and daughters all over the place were called by their leaders to put on uniforms and make themselves available. And those sons, for the most part, although daughters were involved in many ways, they were slaughtered. They were slaughtered in France, they were slaughtered in Germany, they were slaughtered in a way that defies explanation. Every time I watch a movie on television which is about war, I am appalled at the lunacy of it. It cannot be reconciled to anything that is deeply human and deeply true. Something is wrong when war is declared. Now, there are ways in which we always want to honor the people who so willingly gave their lives to serve what their leaders called the necessary purpose. But we do not want to break faith with those young people. We want to say, what was in them that made them so ready to give up so much to serve purposes that they rarely understood? Now, when the war was over, the economic problem was solved. The Industrial Revolution found its ground and we began to flourish, not just in Canada, but in the whole developed world. Every country after the war experienced prosperity. And many of us grew up in that age of prosperity. And I would like you to be clear that that prosperity was nurtured by the blood of boys and girls, human beings, who simply did what they were told. Well, being a child of the 60s, I can no longer simply do what I am told. I have taken seriously the memory of all those who gave themselves, and I want to live in such a way that honors what they paid. I want to pay something. I want to ask myself the question which I've been asking for many years every morning: what can I do? And I have one clear thing in my mind about that question. There is one thing that cannot be chosen as an option. I'm just going to put my head in the sand, pretend that all is grand, and hope that everything turns out okay. That is not an option. We are called now in Canada, in America, in Germany, in all the civilized world to stand on guard, to be sober, to be vigilant, to be careful, mindful, attentive, or else we will inherit what Amos calls the day of the Lord. And there are those who will say to the masses of people, keep on, folks, keep on serving the machine, and everything is going to be great one day. And Amos says, no. You keep going the way you're going and everything is not going to be great. Everything is going to be awful. Everything is going to be terrible. And if we look back over the history of the various wars, we see that each one was more awful and terrible than the one before it. And I assure you that the one that is waiting now to break forward is going to be the worst of all. There may be no survivors, and those who do survive may wish that they hadn't. But Amos does not leave us with a bleak picture. He says there is something that we can do. And if you will remember the text, he says, it's no good to go into places and say, God, we love you so much. God, you are the most precious thing in our lives. We do not get anywhere just singing songs and praying and worshiping. Amos says, let justice flow like waters. And I believe that will be part of what's inscribed on the Martin King Luther Jr. Memorial. That is to say, God will help us find our way forward towards a good outcome if we dedicate ourselves to the work of justice. And then there's Mr. Einstein. Mr. Einstein said at one time, reflecting on the experience of the wars, how is it when leaders declare war, a whole nation will give up so much to enter into that war and give themselves to that war? He said, what is it in us that thinks we would have to give less to make peace? So, this Remembrance Day, all over the earth, I hope that people are not simply being nostalgic and romantic about what happened, so that we hide the fact of how awful it was. How many people in high places in Germany, how many people in high places in Canada, how many people in high places in Japan and in America profited by that bloodshed? How many were made rich and wealthy and powerful on all sides? And on all sides, it was families losing their children to this sacrifice. I want to conclude by lifting up Mr. McCrae's poem, just the last little bit. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If we are to keep faith with those who gave their lives, we must let the light of God's love that is in us shine. And we must let it shine aggressively. We must decide that it's the most important thing in the world to share God's love, to give to all persons, to exclude no persons, and not to be deceived by the darkness that would lead us into oblivion. Each one of us has the possibility of giving our gift towards the hope of peace on this earth. And I trust that you have a hunger for that peace, and that you are prepared to do what it is that you are able to make it so. God being our helper, we may yet pass through the valley of death and come out alive and well. The question is, what can I do? And I think the answer is found in a song that we're going to sing, When Hands Reach Out.